Hey class, today we are going to be talking about the impact of the Great Depression on the culture in America. So when we're looking at this, we're looking at really causation would be our historical thinking skill that we're really kind of honing in on. We can use some other skills. We'll be using periodization, obviously, as we talk about the Great Depression era. So we should be looking at the very late 20s into really, quite frankly, right up to World War II is what brings America out of the Great Depression. But what we're looking at right now is early 30s, and we're looking at how the economic downturn is going to cause a ripple effect of cultural change. So, some things that are going on in America during the Great Depression, as far as cultural changes are concerned, obviously, a lot of people are reeling initially from the impact of a lot of the economic losses in the Great Depression. As many as 30%. Some stats will say 33%, but about a third of people were unemployed during the Great Depression. Like at one point, at the peak of unemployment in the Great Depression, unemployment was about 1 in 3. There were some cities that were harder hit. So some areas, I believe it's Toledo, Ohio, where unemployment was somewhere close to 80%. Uh, so instead of the 1 in 3 being unemployed, it would be 1 in 5 that actually was employed. But by and large, looking at a composite average in America, about 1 in 3 people were unemployed during the Great Depression. And this is going to have an impact, just culturally speaking, as far as consumerism is concerned. So that's one major thing to look at is that the consumerism which was running rampant prior to the Depression, so people buying stock on margin, like on significant margin. So people buying stock where they would invest $1,000 of their own money and their broker would give them a loan for 9,000 more dollars. So we're talking about putting 10% down, uh, is what some people did when they bought stock. And the idea, while the market was doing well, was that people were going to ride that wave all the way to the top. But when that wave broke and the market fell through, a lot of people were saddled with excessive debt, and not just from stock investing. Credit was being used, generally speaking, much more widely. So buying things on credit and also rent to own, so also sometimes referred to back in that era as time payment or time pay, where someone would buy a product like a radio and they would pay extra for it over a larger amount of time. So instead of paying the cost up front, they might pay 150% over the course of 12 months. And people would then have those items that they were buying in that manner repossessed sometimes. Um, so we see people having consumer debt and also some people having investment debt. And it's not just a few wealthy individuals that were doing this leading up to the Great Depression, but it was just the average American that was doing this. A lot of people saw those that were wealthy or those that were considered elite making a lot of money in the rising stock market before the Depression happened, before the stock market crash hit. And so they're getting in on this as well. They have more expendable income because the economy is doing quite well. And instead of saving that, or instead of purchasing a lot of smaller consumer goods, which they did as well, they would take a chunk of their excess money and put it in the market. So that's going to go away. During the Great Depression, one of the cultural changes that is going to occur to some extent is there is less consumerism. It's still going to happen. There still are going to be consumer goods that are made, and consumerism is going to happen, but it's going to change venues, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But consumer confidence drops, and so production of a lot of consumer goods drops as well during the height of the Great Depression. So, I mean, if you're looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which would be more of a sociological concept, but it's applicable here, especially, if you're writing an essay or a DBQ, not if you're writing a short answer response, though. because you want to make sure that you maximize your impact in a minimal amount of space for short answer. But if you're writing an LEQ response or a DBQ response, throwing in Maslow's hierarchy of needs would not be a bad idea, where people generally are going to prioritize things like shelter and food, which would be most basic needs that humans have, over things like entertainment or consumer goods. So as people are struggling to survive because of the economic downturn, they're far more likely to conserve resources for those necessities for the most part than they are to spend them. The one exception to this that we're going to see that's almost universal is in another change that occurs in American culture, and that is escapism through entertainment. So as Hollywood is growing in popularity, we touched base on the idea of The Jazz Singer, the first talking film, I believe in the tail end of the last chapter. Well, now film is becoming much more popular, and a lot of Americans are going to a movie theater, especially those that are in urban areas, are going to a movie theater generally once a week. And people are willing to spend money that could be used for food or could be used for other necessities. They're willing to spend that money on a film to escape the, I don't want to say drudgery of life during the Depression, but really just to escape that oppressive feeling that a lot of America felt like it was under during the Great Depression. They would watch movies that would either portray people living lavish lifestyles. A lot of Fred Astaire movies were like that, where he was a wealthy individual courting a wealthy woman, and they were living a life of luxury. They were at a resort somewhere, or things like that. So there would either be that concept in the movies where they would watch other people living life extravagantly, or there was a genre of comedy that existed in this era called the screwball comedy, where they would watch individuals just being zany, just doing absurd things and being in absurdly strange comical situations, and they would laugh about it during the movie and just escape the realities of life during the Great Depression. So that would be another cultural change. So drop in consumerism, drop in employment, which can both be economic and cultural, especially when we talk about like the cultural stigma around being unemployed during this era. Like shame culture to some extent, where people that were unemployed were viewed as if they had done something wrong in this era in the late 20s and early 30s. And then entertainment culture, which changes and is growing rapidly, and people are willing to engage in entertainment culture even at the risk of spending money that could be used more wisely elsewhere. So those are three major changes that occur. And we're going to see also some things that are occurring in this era where there are some segments of society that are hit particularly hard. So like African Americans before the Great Depression were not making the same rate of gains in employment and an increase in income as other segments of society. And that's largely due to the attitudes of individuals during this time, racist attitudes, attitudes that were trying to keep African Americans down. And so when the Depression hits, they're hit even harder. So they were struggling to make the same level of gains, and the Depression hits. And so then as a lot of individuals' income rates go down, they're also hit particularly hard. Also, women are meeting a lot of resistance to being in the workforce during the Depression. So the traditional idea was that men had their sphere. If you remember, we talked about this with cult of domesticity, and you can make this connection if you're writing an essay on this time period. You can connect this concept to the idea of cult of domesticity that was in the mid-1800s. But generally, there were the ideas of spheres of influence, where the man's sphere of influence in this era was in the workplace, and the woman's sphere of influence was in the home. And the exception to that rule would be the lowest economic class individuals, where it was seen as necessary for married women to work. But generally speaking, in the middle class and the upper class, married women were expected to stay home. Well, now that the Depression has hit and a lot of men are unemployed, there is even more animosity toward the idea of women in the workforce because they're seen as taking a job that an unemployed man could take who is seen as generally solely responsible for earning income for a family in this era. So we see that minorities are hit particularly hard. African Americans are struggling in this situation, and women are struggling to find employment because there is a mindset that they're taking jobs from men who could be using that job to feed their families. So there's just a lot of cultural change going on, and there's really a sense of, I don't want to say despair, I don't want to oversell this here, but there's just a sense of, I would say, not just economic depression, but really emotional depression as well during the Great Depression. It's just a horrible time that America's going through. It is, I mean, if you look at the 1930s and 1920s, the worst depression we've ever had happens then up to that point. And the closest thing we had was the Panic of 1893. So that's like 40 years if we're talking about like 1933. But I mean, really even 37 years prior to this. So a lot of people that are experiencing the Great Depression haven't seen anything like it before. And those that are old enough to know the Panic of 1893 know what they're in for. That depression in 1893 lasted quite a while, and it had a big impact in a negative way economically on America. So a lot of people are just feeling like they're under the weight of this economic downturn. But again, escapist programming, escapist radio broadcasts as well, which I haven't mentioned yet. I mentioned movies. But there's a lot of escapist radio programming as well that's going on where people are still listening to the radio. They're listening to Fireside Chats by, we're going to see in 1933, by FDR when he gets around to Fireside Chats. And they're listening to radio broadcasts that are similar. They're either comedy or they're upbeat. They're about success and about positive things, generally speaking. Now, of course, there are going to be broadcasts that are about different things that are less entertaining, but radio and movie broadcasting would be escapist. So if we're looking at themes here, or if we're looking at trends, we could be looking at change. So patterns of continuity and change. Change would be new forms of escapism during this recession or depression. If we're looking at patterns of continuity, we'd be looking at America has economic downturns on a semi-regular basis. Like every 20 years, every 30 years-ish, America goes through a recession or a depression, and it's a time of hardship, and then we come back through on the other side, and the economy strengthens again. So as we're looking at those historical thinking skills, that's just something to keep in mind. But the big thing is here that it's not just economic changes that are occurring, there are cultural changes as well. So what I want you to do, and I'll put this in the assignment as well, where you all have access to this video, is listen to an excerpt from a Depression-era radio broadcast just to get a feel for what's going on in the society, and then that can serve as a basis for discussion on Block Day. All right, I hope you all have a great day. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Bye, guys.